You're listening to the podcast of The Branch in Ashland, Virginia. We were created for community, created for connection with God and with one another. God doesn't do the work that he needs to do on us in isolation, but in community. We interact with others in different spaces, public, social, personal, and intimate. Over the next 4 weeks, we'll be looking at these spaces, what they are, and how God works in them. At the heart of each and every one of us, there's a need for community. If we go back and read in the book of Genesis, the creation account in the Bible, we see that God creates and he says it's good, and then he creates Adam and he says it's very good. But he also sees that Adam in and of himself is incomplete, that what isn't good for Adam is for him to be alone. And so God creates Eve not only with the intention of being fruitful and multiplying and filling the earth, but also because Adam needed companionship that he could find nowhere else. He needed community that he could find nowhere else. And we were created for community and connection. In the 1960s, a sociologist by the name of Edward Hall, he coined the term proxemics. And proxemics is described as a study of human use of space and the effects that population density has on behavior, on communication, and on social interaction. Hall found that human beings connect with one another in 4 different spaces: in public space, in social space, in personal space, and in intimate space. In these various spaces, we connect with one another, and in these various spaces, God shapes us and forms us to be who he wants us to be. He shapes us in and through the community that we're in. In their book, Church's Movement, Dan White Jr. and J.R. Woodward write this. They say our brain's neurons tether together based on how much care we give and receive from a social structure. If there's minimal giving and receiving, our brains change. Reciprocal, loving relationships alter our brains significantly. As the brain registers communal relationships, it extends its notion of self to include others. Instead of the slender I, a plural self-image emerges. The brain rewires for a new self-understanding, a new identity that includes others, moving from I to we. Science attests to the fact that God has designed us for community. And in that they point out to us that we were created for community, and our brains actually change when we experience that community with one another. We all want to be seen by somebody, especially by the one who created us. We long for someone to say, I see you, especially God who created us. And we want to connect with one another. We're created by God to connect with one another with a desire to be seen and to be known. And today as we look at these spaces today and over the next few weeks, specifically looking at public space today, we look at the account in Mark chapter 5 of a woman who goes out into public space with one intention, and yet her intention and God's intention were different in that. So if you have a Bible, you can turn to Mark chapter 5, starting in verse 24. The second half of Mark 5:24. The second half says, a large crowd followed and pressed around him, and a woman was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years. She'd suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors and had spent all she had, yet instead of getting better, she grew worse. When she heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak because she thought, if I just touch his clothes, I'll be healed. Immediately, her bleeding stopped, and she felt in her body that she was freed from her suffering. And once Jesus realized that power had gone out from him, and he turned around in the crowd and asked, "Who touched my clothes?" "You see the people crowding against you," his disciples answered, "and yet you can ask, 'Who touched me?'" But Jesus kept looking around to see who had done it. And the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell at his feet, and trembling with fear, she told him the whole truth. And he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering." We just went through the holidays, and there are some people, I grew up just outside New York City, and never in my life, in my 40 plus years, have I ever gone to Times Square to experience New Year's Eve down there. But I can imagine that as Jesus is walking through this crowd, that it's packed with people. There's not a whole lot of space as Jesus is making his way through. And as Jesus' public ministry continues, more and more people hear about him. More and more people are showing up in these kinds of situations. People were crowded against each other, pressing in on every side. And here's this woman who for 12 years has suffered with bleeding. Now, I don't know what your imaginations are like, but regardless, thinking about suffering with something like this for 12 years. I mean, my kids get a cut and they don't want to suffer for 12 minutes, right? This is something way more extensive than that. This woman has done everything in her power and in her finances in order to try to get healed. And instead, not only has she not gotten healed, she's gotten worse, and she's spent everything that she has. There's no mention of a husband here either. We don't know whether she had one and she's widowed, whether she was divorced, whatever. Here in this place, she's by herself. She's alone. And based on what's been happening to her for the last 12 years, she's considered ceremonially unclean by the Old Testament law. Because anyone who comes in contact with blood is considered to be unclean. And so imagine the isolation that she's feeling. Imagine what it feels like for her every day waking up and thinking, what do I do next? I've tried every possible solution, and it's not just not worked, it's made things worse for me. And so here she is, unclean, isolated, and alone. Michael Card, in his commentary on Mark, writes this: in the context of first century Judaism, she's been cut off from her community by ritual uncleanness that's lasted 12 years. Again, in every conversation, I feel like talking about the last few years, there's this constant mention of the 2 years of COVID that has done so much like irreparable damage to us individually. That was to all of us together for 2 years. Imagine multiplying that by 6. And imagine a woman who is completely isolated, alone. She can't go to the temple because she's unclean. She can't go hang out with other people. And so today in this account, she says, hey, I'm going to dare to venture out. But it was risky for her because, again, by the law, if she touched anybody else, they would be rendered unclean as well. And she would be punished because she knew what she was. She knew what she was struggling with. And so she's mustered up after 12 years and probably after hearing stories about Jesus and what he was capable of, she's mustered up the energy and the courage to say, hey, I'm going to go out. Now, did people know her? Probably. So she was probably, doing her best to stay incognito as she ventured out into the crowd. And she thought to herself, if I can just get in, touch his cloak, and get out, I'll be okay. No one will see me. No one will know me. I'll fly under the radar. And maybe, just maybe, this guy is who he says he is, and I'll be healed from this. Now, when it comes to coming here to the branch on a Sunday morning, it's a little bit harder for us because of our size to get in and get out without being seen, especially if Leslie's at the door, right? Like, she's going to see everybody who walks through the door. But there are certain places that are much, much larger. And it's easy to kind of sneak in and be stealth and then get out again. Some people, they search for bigger churches because of the programs that they offer, or the connections that can be made, or the experience that they can have there, the worship experience. But there are some who go into those larger spaces so that they can avoid being seen. So they can just kind of come in, be under the radar, blend in, and then get out again. Remember, God created us to be connected with one another. It wasn't good for man to be alone. In his book, Search to Belong, Joseph Myers writes this. He says, "In fact, public belonging is a space where we need numerous significant relationships in order to experience a sense of healthy belonging and community. We need to develop more connections in this space than in any of the other three." We need public space to make connections, and not insignificant connections with other people. And so if we struggle with public space, we may be struggling with being visible and being seen by other people. We may, like this woman, be trying to get in, get out, and fly under the radar. Even though this woman was doing her best to avoid being seen, Jesus had other plans. It's kind of one of fascinating discovery that I made this week. The Bible was written in the Old Testament originally in the Hebrew language, the New Testament in the Greek language, and going back sometimes you see nuances that you can't normally see if you're just reading it in English. In verse 31, as Jesus realizes that somebody has touched him, the disciples say, "You see the people crowding against you, and yet you can ask, 'Who touched me?'" The way that Mark writes this, he uses a word in Greek for see, which is blepo, which it strictly means to look at someone. And just kind of acknowledge that you've seen them physically. You've laid eyes on them. You've made note of them. But in that next verse, in verse 32, Mark writes, "But Jesus kept looking around to see who had done it." And even though he had just used a different word for see in the verse before, he uses another word, or horao, which is described as seeing with the mind. Seeing spiritually, to instruct or seeing inwardly, having an inward perception of someone, not just physically laying eyes on someone, but actually seeing them deeper. The verb is also used in the imperative as a means to instruct the disciples or the readers to do more than just simply look with your eyes, but to look deeper than that. And this action is seen as one that's used to grasp truth of an observation. Not just to physically account for something, but to see deeper. It's used in this specific form to mean knowing or seeing that becomes knowledge. Seeing something deeper. Like our English expression, "I see what you mean." It's more than just a physical looking at something. It's understanding. Grasping a spiritual truth beyond the physical plane, seeing mentally and spiritually as well. You see, Jesus didn't just want to lay his eyes on the person who had touched his robe. He wanted to actually see them. He wanted to know who it was. He wanted to not just observe her, but to see her and know her. And Jesus does the same for us as well. We may be trying to get in and out, but Jesus sees us. Not just physically laying his eyes on us, seeing us deeply, and he says, "I see you. If we look back in the Old Testament in the book of Genesis, chapter 16, we read the account of Hagar, who was Sarah's maidservant. Abraham and Sarah, God had made a promise to Abraham that he and Sarah would have children even though they were really old, or as we say in New England, wicked old, okay? They were really old, and God had promised that they would have a child, and no child was coming. And so Sarah thought, hey, the next best thing would be to give my husband, my maidservant, who's young and will be able to have a baby. And so that's what happens. And Hagar has a baby named Ishmael, and then Sarah has second thoughts. Imagine that. And she starts treating Hagar horribly, and Hagar runs away because she doesn't want to deal with that treatment. And as she runs away, God pursues her. And the angel of the Lord finds her and says, God has seen you. And the way that Hagar responds, she calls God El Roi, the God who sees me. That in the midst of feeling abandoned and feeling oppressed, God sees her. And God sees us even when we're running away. God sees us not just physically with his eyes, but he sees us and he knows us deeply. When it comes to larger groups like public space groups, we may find ourselves in one of two different groups. We may really like large groups, and we may dislike smaller ones. Or we may hate and loathe large groups and long for much smaller groups. But I wonder, whichever side we're on in that, whether we like large groups and love small groups or vice versa, how are we using or misusing the public space? If we like large groups, are we liking it for the right reason? Like I said before, there are some people who are looking for larger groups so that they can fly under the radar. And so they might be using large groups for the wrong reason. They're coming into that to just simply be passive religious consumers. But God still sees them. And for those who like smaller groups and dislike larger ones, how might they be misusing public space? Maybe we say, hey, you know what? I don't like large groups. I don't do well in large groups, so I'm just going to avoid large groups altogether. Do we hide outside large groups, not allowing ourselves to be seen? Because if we don't like large groups, chances are we don't want to be seen. Not just by other people, but maybe even by God. You remember what happened in Genesis when Adam and Eve had sinned and they disobeyed God's command to them. They were hiding, and yet God still found them and saw them. God sees us even when we're hiding. God sees us even when we're doing our best to fly under the radar and not be seen. He sees us either way. And part of our responsibility in community is to see others the way that God sees them. It's to see them and connect with them. I may joke about no one being able to get by Leslie, but there's a gift there in what she brings to community in seeing people and recognizing people. And it's been a gift to me to say, hey, you know what? Sometimes I just walk right past people. And I need to remember that I need to see people the way that God sees them. Not just physically acknowledge them, hey, what's up? But to actually see them, to know them deeply. Public space will not provide an experience of bonded community. If we're seeking bonded community, we need to go to those other spaces to find that. To social space, to personal space, to intimate space. In public space, I think we talk about what I call SWF, which does not stand for single white female. It stands for sports, weather, and family. Those are the connections and the conversations that we have in public space. We're not going to find intimacy and bonded community within public space. This woman was not able to find that there, but she was able to be seen by Jesus. I think what can often happen with us in these various spaces is that we try to accomplish something in a space that space was never intended to do. I think about my father-in-law who's a contractor, and he's got all these tools, and half of them I don't even know not only what they're called, but what they do. But like, if he wants a hammer, he's going to want that hammer to either get a nail out or put a nail in or whatever it is. If he wants a saw, he wants to cut something with it. But you're not going to go to a job that needs a saw with a hammer and think that you're actually going to get something done, at least not effectively, and vice versa. And I think sometimes we look at the spaces and we say, I want to get everything that I need in this space right here. And Jesus is saying, no. No, I actually have all of these spaces intentionally set up because I want to do something different in you and through you in those spaces. Are you letting me do that? I honestly think that when we misuse the spaces that God has laid out for us, that we aren't allowing him to do the work in us that he needs to do. We're avoiding it. We're saying, hey, you know what? Like, I don't like public space, so I'm just going to avoid it altogether. What is God trying to do even in the discomfort of public space? Maybe you don't like smaller groups and you're like, yeah, give me the big groups all day long, but like I want to avoid the smaller ones. What is God trying to do in the discomfort of those other spaces? All of us will find ourselves feeling slightly uncomfortable in spaces. But what is God trying to do in that discomfort? Growth rarely happens in comfortable situations, right? How many of us ever feel like, when we go and work out that we're like, oh, this is the best. I love this. I've never felt better. Like afterwards we might, but in the midst of it, Matt and I go with another guy to the gym and I look at him, loathing him in certain exercises that we do. And I'm like, I hate you in this moment. And sometimes in these moments that God puts us in, we realize it's not the actual moment, it's what happens afterwards. Who do we become? What is God doing to us afterwards? And we say, yeah, I like that. I didn't like that. But the outcome is what God's after. It's what God's trying to do in us. And no, it's not comfortable. No, it's not easy. But God has something to do in us. Think about this woman. She had to take a step out into the unknown, into the uncomfortable, into the scary. She was risking a lot to go out. If somebody had identified her and said, hey, unclean, unclean, she would have been in big trouble. But she was willing to make that sacrifice. She was willing to risk it so that she could experience the healing touch and power of Jesus. And I wonder if we allow ourselves the discomfort and take the risk and make the sacrifice in order that Jesus can do the work that he needs to do in us and sometimes through us as well. Are there places in our life where we need to step out into the discomfort of a certain space in order that we might experience the healing touch and power of Jesus, or that others might experience that healing touch and power through us as well? So, what do we do with all this? The first question to ask is, how do you understand public space in your own life? In a group that I've been meeting with, I challenged and encouraged them to sit down and say, hey, if you need to, if you're a visual person, you like to make lists, like list out the public spaces in your life, the spaces where you inhabit, where, some of the descriptions that Hall put out there as a sociologist was that it was like 70 plus people. In which spaces in life are you interacting with that large of a group? And then ask yourself this: where is it that you're longing to be seen by Jesus? Where is it that you desperately need your Heavenly Father to see you? Not just physically lay eyes on you, but to see you deeply and know you. And then finally, where is it that you need to be touched by Jesus? Where is it? After 12 years, you imagine that this woman was probably like, I just give up. I'm done. And yet she still persisted. She still went out and took that risk. And I wonder, are there places in our life that we've just been like, you know what? God can't do anything with this. I've struggled with alcohol, or I've struggled with pornography, or I've struggled with spending, or I've struggled with whatever it might be. God can't fix this. And we just need to say, you know what, God, I've tried everything else. I just need your touch and your healing in this space. And be honest about it. One of the things that we try to be here at the Branch is a place where life and faith meet so that God can break down barriers to his grace. And we don't just throw that up there to be a nice slogan, but I hope that's something that we embody. That's who we are being and becoming. A place where God can do what he needs to do, and we're allowed to share that honestly and openly with one another. No, we're not going to shout it out in a big group and say, hey, let me tell you all my struggles. But as we look through these different spaces, can we find space, intimate space and personal space and social space and public space where God does what he needs to do in those spaces? Over the next couple weeks, in a few weeks, we're going to be going through this book, Emotionally Healthy Spirituality, on Monday nights, meeting twice a month for the next few months. I hope and encourage you all to be part of that. We'll be doing it in person. If that's not possible, we'll try to make arrangements for other things, but we don't want people to feel like, oh, well, I can only make a few of the meetings, so I'm not going to go to any of them. I hope that regardless of how many you can be a part of, that you'll join us for that as we walk through, as we try to understand a little bit more what God is trying to do within us, so that as a community we can be seen and we can see others in the midst. And we can understand that, yes, even in the midst of, and even before a holy God, he still sees us. He doesn't see us and detest us. He sees us and loves us. And says, you are enough. I love you. We all need that. Let me pray for us. God, I am thankful to be seen by you, and that's an uncomfortable thought in so many ways, because I know that you see beyond just the physical. I know that you see into my heart, into my very being, and what's there isn't always the cleanest, the most presentable. And yet you don't sit there and say, I see you in judgment. You sit there and say, I see you in love. And I see you through Christ. Because our righteousness, it doesn't come from who we are or what we've done, but it comes because and through what you've done for us, Jesus. And so, God, I pray that as we explore this idea of the four spaces over these next few weeks, that you would speak to us of where we need to be allowing you to do the uncomfortable work, the growth that can only happen in that discomfort. God, I'm grateful for so many in this community who have helped me, whether it's physical workouts, whether it's spiritual, mental, emotional workouts, that God, you've used them to shape and form me. And I pray that we would continue to seek out ways that we can shape and form each other, that we would be who you are calling us to be. God, thank you for the gift of community and what we receive, who we become within that community. May we seek to look more and more like you every day. I pray in Jesus' name. Amen. In public space, we can be seen. God sees us just like he saw the woman who touched his robe. Are we allowing ourselves to be seen, and are we seeing others in the public space that we inhabit? God has work to do in us through others in all of the spaces. Are we allowing him to work in those spaces the way that he wants to, or are we looking to misuse the spaces for our own purpose? I hope you'll join us again as we continue this journey through the spaces of belonging. Thanks for listening to our podcast. If you have any questions or comments, please email us at thebranchashland@gmail.com. If you like what you heard, please subscribe, give us a review, and share with your friends and family. Thanks for listening. See you next time.